And thank you all for having me. This is actually a picture of me in college, probably 5 years ago with my wife. That was last Easter. The three in the front are triplets. We actually had quadruplets. We lost one. The eldest daughter is 3, and we said we were done last fall, and then we found out in January another was on the way. And that was just a gift, actually. We lost a boy, and you're going to hear my story about being a brother with my brother, and we're having a boy in September. So for me, I told someone last week, I didn't even want to ask God that he would give us a boy because I was afraid that my hopes would be dashed. And for him to then redeem that, if you will, and just sort of give me the desire of my heart without me ever asking for it, such a gift and a blessing. All right, today the topic is striving. You're going to, I think, and I hope, appreciate why this topic is so near and dear to me. And I believe it would be difficult to find somebody in this room who's never experienced a period of striving. And we're going to talk more about that. But here's a striver. Who has seen this movie? Okay, this is a picture of the actor who portrayed Eric Liddell in the movie Chariots of Fire. Chariots of Fire actually was Best Picture, 1981. Also happened to be the year that I was born. And I grew up in a Christian family. I was blessed to come to know the Lord early. I became a Christian. I professed my faith as a 7-year-old, and it actually was real. God had found me. We all know the experience, basically, that each of us has when God shows up. But he found me at Canaan camps when I was a 7-year-old. I still remember where I was sitting. I still remember who was talking. I still remember the talk. But I'd been in a Christian family, cultivated that way. My dad was a surgeon. We were from New Zealand, and despite the idea that was mentioned about politics, it's not true. But we do like to joke about it. I always say that if I get deported from America, I'm going back to New Zealand, and there are worse things in life. So, what's that? That's right. But Eric Liddell, he was a champion in our family. My dad had grown up playing rugby in New Zealand, and he was an achiever. And his father was an achiever. My dad is an accomplished surgeon, but he was a talented rugby player. And sitting around the dinner table, constantly, my brother and I would sort of think, okay, what are these things that we could do with our lives? And one of the heroes of my youth is this guy. And the story of Eric Liddell, which I'm not going to go into in too much detail, is he was a tremendous sprinter. He actually was a winger rugby player, and he would get the ball and just sprint down the wing. And they sort of learned that this guy's got some talent. And they began to sort of see, okay, would you like to race? Would you like to be a sprinter? And the story goes on. He actually became he became known as the Flying Scotsman, and he had a chance to go to the Olympics. And the story goes that he qualified for the Paris Olympics. He goes down with the British contingent, and it turns out that his main event was I think it was the 800. But unfortunately, the heats to qualify were on a Sunday, and he had committed that he would not let sports interfere with his faith. And so there's this incredible scene in the movie, and everybody has tried to basically convince him, hey, it's just this one Sunday, would you just relax it? So you can't even qualify for your event if you don't run the heat. And the scene in the movie is of him preaching that Sunday in Paris to a group of people while his competitors are running the heat. He doesn't qualify. Amazingly, somebody gives him their slot for a different event, one that he has not trained for. And ultimately, he goes on to not only qualify, but win the gold medal in the 400. So it's an incredible story. But it struck me at a young age as an incredible story of somebody who had such conviction in their faith and would not compromise. And he could have continued as a legend in the sport, but he gave it up. And at that point, he moved to China. And he died in relative obscurity, serving in internment camps. And one of the sort of hallmarks of this guy's life was that he was dashing around these internment camps trying to be the encourager to basically the other men who were there, trying to lift them up in their faith, basically as an example. So he used his athletic talent to basically be spent physically. And, if you read the books and history of his life, he was gaunt by the time he died. He looked terrible. And as I say, he died in relative obscurity. But he was admired by the guards in the internment camp because of his energy. But this guy was my hero. And so for me, of course, there was a desire to be an athlete at one point. But when I realized that that was not going to be an opportunity for anything serious, I began to sort of turn my attention towards business. And as mentioned, I ended up at Goldman Sachs. I went to college actually with this burning desire to do something great in business. And in many regards, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you don't go to Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is for people who want institutional pathway. But for me, I didn't know what business I wanted to start. And so I got good advice from a professor, which was basically, hey, if you don't know what you want to do, that's fine. Just go out and learn something. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to go in the most competitive direction that I could consider, and it was to go learn finance. And I was fortunate. There had been actually an alum from Indiana University who had gone to Goldman Sachs. He was a partner at the time. I overnighted him my resume, and he actually returned the call and connected me to a recruiter, and I somehow got the job. And Goldman Sachs is, it's a striver's paradise, is probably the best way to put it. Because if you are driven, if you are ambitious, if you are interested in prosperity, it's a great place to find those things. And there's a lot of other people who actually, in that environment, have learned to mask the ambition, but actually it's sitting underneath everybody who is there. And so for me, this was an incredible opportunity. It was in some regards a dream come true. I'd come from the Midwest to big bad New York. I was working in investment banking, and 2 years after doing that, which was rigorous and grueling, and I slept under my desk and all that sort of fun stuff that you hear about, I then got a privileged opportunity within Goldman Sachs to join one of their elite investing groups. And I don't even know how I got that job. But I had been reading about Warren Buffett, and I had an interest in investing, and I was thrilled at that opportunity. And it was like the ride of my life. I was 24 years old, and had influence and experience with, tens of millions of dollars being invested on behalf of Goldman Sachs. Could fly anywhere in the world if I thought something was interesting. It was basically like a limitless opportunity to explore money-making opportunity, right? And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. But this guy, my brother, called me 2 years into that experience and said, Will, he was a management consultant. He had his own strivings. But he'd lived in Mexico City after he graduated from college, and he was he was interested in the region of Latin America. And it was a certain time in his life where he was actually applying to business schools. And of course, business schools want to know what it is that you want to do with your life. And so he had actually gained a vision for serving in the community within Central America, but with commerce. And his observation when he'd been in Mexico City was, there's so many people willing to work. They have a desire to work. They want to work. And they're hungry. And they're not stupid. And there's just not that much opportunity. And so he began to share with me his vision for basically, what could we do? What might we do? Is there something that we could do with our passion for commerce, but also a desire for people? And we had grown up doing overseas missions work. His year in Mexico City was a missions year. So we had the influence in our upbringing of wanting to serve the poor, going to their location, basically being in context, and essentially wanting to say, okay, what can we do to help? I think many of you have done short-term missions work. Typically what happens, you go to help and you realize that you've been helped in the process, right? You might build a home or things of that nature, but we were saying we want to give our careers, we want to give our working hours. And one of the things that struck me when I was at Goldman, and it was really what was necessary for me to leave the sort of pathway that I was on, I came back from my meeting with my boss where I got my bonus, and I sat at my desk, and the first thought I had was, I'm not worth what I just got paid. Because I was a rookie, as a junior. And then the second thought was, so what's next year? And what's next year? And what's the year after that? And what is this compartment of commerce all about? And it's really just about that number being bigger the next year, and perhaps the title growing as you do that. And ultimately, it just, that's the aspiration. And at some point, what I would see is people would become entitled. Last year is your high water mark, so this year you got to have more. And I looked out and sort of saw it was like God gave me a view of that trajectory, and I said, that is not what my life is going to be about. And so as I responded to what my brother had sort of shared with me, I said, you know what? I don't want to tithe my dollars. I want to give my career. And I want to basically integrate my faith and work in such an active way that basically like they're inextricably tied to one another. So we set about building a business model that basically would do this. Honduras is not far from here. It's actually a 2-hour flight from Miami. Okay, so I can leave LaGuardia at 5 a.m. and be at our factory by midday. Okay, that's really close. It's almost closer than going to California. But it's decades behind in terms of its economy. It's the third poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. It has one of the highest homicide rates in the world, but it is a beautiful country. It's not a surprise. It's in the tropics, right? It's the former Banana Republic. There's a lot of things that have happened there and gone on there. But long story short, they have resources, and we began to think, what could we do with these resources? And so we gravitated towards timber and began to think, what could we do with this? And of course, you could think about all the sort of basic things you might do, but we actually decided to start a toy company to use wood and transform it in the country with the idea of essentially selling a product around the world that would use the local wood, but essentially put people to work in the process. And so the goal and the vision was very simple. Don't let those trees out of the country before they become something valuable for export. And the only way that those trees become valuable for export is if people actually transform the wood into something valuable. So for us, it was we're going to export a finished product. We actually make one of the most premium toys in the industry. And the toy that ultimately was invented was a magnetic wooden building block system, and that's what we've been selling. We've sold close to 1 million units since we started, and we've been very blessed in many regards. Tegu is short for Tegucigalpa. It's the capital city of the nation of Honduras, and it's where the factory is. And this is what it looked like when we started. There was nothing there, and this is the space a couple of days ago. Actually an adjacent space. The first picture is beyond that wall. This picture is a space that we literally are christening next week. And there's been tremendous joy in this process. I can't describe fully what the experience was like when I walked into that empty factory and actually saw the machines humming and the blocks being made. And this had just been an idea on paper. And then to see people working at stations and actually turning the wood into toys was just one of the most gratifying and satisfying experiences of my life. And there's been tremendous joy. The people on this page for me represent so much just sort of happiness in my heart when I think about their lives, etc. At one point, the team had grown so substantially. I think we were about 300 people working 2 shifts, basically trying to pump the product out. And one of our biggest challenges has been producing enough product to meet the demand that we've been able to generate. So we've been incredibly blessed in that regard. Quick story here. This woman's is named Carla. She started with us in packaging, just putting blocks into the packages, and she was so committed, so eager to learn that she began to grow and escalate in the company, and ultimately she became one of our shift managers and earned 4 times her original pay rate in joining the business. So incredible story. She learned what she needed to learn. She knew nothing when she started. And this is what we hope for. This is what we try to do. But I really didn't come here to talk to you about our achievements. I want to talk to you about my experience as an entrepreneur, and then I'm going to finish with basically what I think the Bible says about striving. So I share this chart quite often. This, for me, kind of encapsulates what it's like to start something as an entrepreneur. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but when you're starting something, you have a vision for it, and basically you say, like, this has to happen. This is such a good idea. I am brilliant. I figured it out. I have found the thing that must become a reality. And for entrepreneurs, you're taking an idea and turning it into a tangible reality. For us, this was taking a business plan and turning it into blocks, right? And but you don't know what you don't know. And some conventional wisdom would say VCs don't invest in entrepreneurs who haven't already failed because they actually don't know what it's actually like to do it. And so I was a rookie for sure, and I was a confident rookie. But you know, I think ultimately it didn't take very long for things to get off track, for things to get off plan. And if you actually open up the original 60-page business plan that we wrote, it said we will need $1.5 million of equity capital to basically get this business profitable. And after that point, we'll start to return capital to investors. Today, we have raised $20 million. We are not profitable. And somehow the Lord has sustained us. Next month will be a 10-year anniversary for me working on this project. Okay? And so not long into the experience, I began to sort of experience a sense of despondency, a sense of despair. I was so embarrassed with our lack of results. And there's a sense of shame because I had gone out and basically said, we're going to do this. We're going to integrate our faith. We're going to put it in this business context, and it's going to be profitable. It's going to be lucrative. It's going to be good for you as an investor, and it's going to be great for the kingdom. I didn't share that with everybody, but many of our Christian investors, you know, they were excited about this. And this is a double or a triple bottom line business. We've got a social impact. There's a potential financial reward. And then there's obviously also the spiritual possibility of what God might do when you sort of bring those two things together. The cool thing is, at some point you realize, yeah, businesses don't go according to plan. Things are more difficult than you should have expected. And you actually realize, I should have known that this was going to be difficult. And you actually begin to sort of confront the obstacles and embrace them and say, you know what, actually we can work through these. And hope begins to rise. And this is what I call informed optimism. This is the point at which you're basically saying, you know, there's really good stuff to come here. But again, the story for me is about a story of pain. This is something called the Wong-Baker Faces of Pain rating scale. I love this because this was actually there next to the bedside when my wife was delivering our first child. And the reason this exists is because when you look at someone, you can't actually tell how much pain they're in. You know, like when you see a sports injury, you wait until the reports after the game to hear actually how bad it was, because you can't actually tell what happened. They might have torn their ACL or just tweaked their knee, right? And in the case of hospital settings, when somebody's grimacing on their face, we don't know if it's like excruciating or just they have a low pain threshold, right? You certainly can't tell by looking at them. So you actually hand this scale to someone and say, okay, where are you? Where would you find yourself on the scale? And really what I'm trying to say is, because of all the hope and ambition and desire for Tegu to sort of be this wonderfully concocted mix of integrated faith and work, I had an expectation that it was going to go well. And it wasn't going well. And in many regards, I could argue today it's still not going well. And so I've identified myself at the 10 side of this scale more times than I could count. There have been tears. There have been depression. There's been all sorts of things in this process. And along the way, probably about halfway into my experience, as I was grappling with this like expectations versus reality mismatch, some brothers in my life were basically there walking through that challenge, and one of them introduced me to Andrew Murray. He's a South African minister and itinerant preacher, and just some incredible books that he wrote. But one of the books is called Absolute Surrender, and I got this book, and the basic premise of the book is it's either God's way or your way. And by the way, if you want it to be God's way and it's currently your way, you can't actually make that happen. God makes that happen. God does that work in your life. God redeems your heart. God is the one who steps into your mess and says, I am the king. And the only thing that we have to do is surrender. It sounds easy, right? Sounds simple. Just surrender. Just let it go. Let it go, right? But as you read the book, what Murray goes on to say is actually you need to die to self. And in the world, especially the world that I'd come from, and I think much of the world that we've been in, this is absolutely antithetical to what you hear. What we hear is you got to go out and get yours. You got to make your space. It's a tough dog-eat-dog world. You need, only the fittest survive, right? So basically, you got to fight it out and make it work. And if you don't do that, somebody's going to do it for you, right? They're going to do it in front of you. And so this was entirely counter to the ideas that I'd had for what we might do with the business, which was basically like, let it go. Drop it. And interestingly for me, what I began to experience only by God's grace was that I needed to die to self. I needed to die to the requirement of my success. I needed to die to the, I say this all the time, so, what plans have we made for God, right? How amazing are we that we basically go to God and say, here it is, God. This is kind of how it needs to go, and this is what I expect, and here's the timeline. And I would say, as Christians, sometimes we're even entitled, which is we give up something, and we go and work on something, and we say, God, I did this for you, so therefore you must basically turn around and sort of do it for me. We place these conditions upon God as if he's somebody that can be bartered with. He's God, right? We're not. And so what I began to realize was actually that every time I was hitting an obstacle, every time my pride was getting wounded because we weren't advancing like I thought we should, I was dying. And for the first 5 years, I was resisting this. Mount up, work more, basically get stronger, find ways to basically dig down, figure this out. And then I began to experience, in the context of reading this book, like, oh, that hurt, but that's good. Oh, I lost that, but I didn't need it. God, your way is better than my way. Take whatever you need. And I remember praying this particular prayer where I laid out everything in my life that was precious. My children, my family, my wife, my business, my house, all the things that basically I ascribed maximum value to. And the sort of greatest moment for me was when I realized, God, I'm going to pray the prayer that I really don't want to pray, but I must pray because you have brought me to this point. For me to die, I have to give it all up. And so I wrote those things down, and I put a box around them, and I basically sat it down next to my desk, and I said, God, take them. Take these. If you must, take every single one of these. Do what you need to do to bring about the death of me and the rise of you in my life. And that prayer, basically, one I'll never forget, was one of the greatest moments of spiritual joy I've ever experienced, because basically there's nothing else. I had nothing else to cling to. There was no other identity or source of worth that would basically give me value, right? I put it in the box and I said, I put it at the altar, take whatever you need. And he's still taking things, okay? We're not profitable. I'm not a success from sort of the way that I laid it out for my investors originally. All right, so what do we do with this? I think, let me share with you a reflection I had at that time in my life, because I wrote this to some friends, and I hope this will sort of portray better kind of where I'd come to in this moment, and then we're going to finish with a bit of scripture. I said, the Lord has given me vision to see that there are two paths. There's the path of feebleness, timidity, and comfort. I have lived this path without knowing it, but I know now that I have chosen it. I have defined the fool in Proverbs. I have clung to the world while pretending that I'm all in for Jesus. And then there is a second path. I see it just now emerging in the clearing fog that reveals a valley I have never seen before, a valley I have never been able to see. It is a valley of conflict. It is a valley of pain. It is a valley that will daily claim my life as I currently know it. In fact, I cannot journey through this valley without first the death of will. He is writing a new song for a new life, for one that before I would have only scorned. How unexciting, I would have said. How boring, how meek, how poor. But no, Will, your ignorant and haughty mocking has ended. And as I enter this valley, I am met by Christ himself. He is at the gate and he welcomes me. His eyes bid me come in. His look is one of seasoned expectancy. He is proud of me that I am here, that I have shown up. For few have entered this valley, but it is one that Jesus delights to reveal to those who die to find it. And this valley is replete with confrontation. I will confront things I know today and things I do not know, but he will be my side. I will war in his army, and I will not be sidelined, for he has hitched me to himself as I've entered the gate. We are inseparably tethered. I cannot go out of his sight. I cannot wander off. There is much work to be done. Mount up, Will. Welcome to the army of the Lord God Almighty. And he could not be more delighted that I am here. A good journey has ended, but the journey is dawning. Sleep soundly and get great rest. Welcome to the rest of your life, Will. There was one verse that unequivocally came to me as I thought about what I wanted to share today, and I love the Bible, particularly when I really wrestle with it, and I love God's Word. He's given it to us as a gift, and I wouldn't profess to have any wisdom apart from it, and nothing of what I've said thus far really sort of compares to what I wanted to share here. There's this great verse in James. James, I didn't know this until I started studying it. James was written by the brother of Jesus. The brother of Jesus. The guy who was there when Jesus was 10. The guy who was there when Jesus went into ministry. The brother, the blood brother of Jesus. The guy who knows intimately what that guy was really like. And the book's a little bit unforgiving. It's not very grace-filled, okay? In fact, it opens by saying, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds." Okay, you're getting into something, frank. I'll put it that way. But he says here, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." All right, I just want to share sort of 3 quick points here. I think the first, I sort of broke this down. The first one is basically, if you read this first section, James is calling a certain people out. He's basically saying, those of you who are confident, those of you who are convinced, those of you who basically are saying, I'm going to do this and this is how it's going to go, et cetera. I'm talking to you. And I'm going to say basically for this room, that's every single person here. And what part of the reason it's every single person here is the gift and blessing God's given us. We get to plan. Planning's not bad. In fact, actually, when we look around, you could look at this verse very simplistically and say, wait a second, maybe we're just supposed to let it all go. Maybe we're not supposed to think ahead. Maybe we're not supposed to be advanced planners. But God has made us in his image, right? He's a planner. He is the perfect and supreme planner. And he planned that it would be good and right that you're here this morning. And he planned also that it would be good and right that your life would be brought to himself. And so here, he's not saying don't plan. He's basically saying, you who do this regularly and are essentially acting in the image of God by making plans, which, by the way, is all of us. Okay, I'm talking to you. And, for me, this is my business plan, right? Come now, you say, I'm going to go into Tegu. I've got a business plan and it's going to be profitable. By the way, you should get involved and invest in the company. But James warns us, you don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. And so the first thing to say is planning is not bad. Making plans and pursuing excellence, these things are of the Lord. Let's not make a mistake here of saying that we should get apathetic. He demands our excellence, and we need to engage in that process. The second point, though, he says, what is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. This is James basically saying, wake up. Consider yourself in the context of the great God Almighty who spoke this world into existence. Wake up. What is a mist? Right? We see a mist on a lake in the morning, it's gone in a flash. Right? Just get the sun up a little bit, it's gone. That's what he says our lives are. Whether it's 80 years or 40 years or 20 years or 100 years. Right? It's a mist. What's James doing? He's not trying to put you down. He's basically saying, wait, just step back. Get a healthy dose of reality. God is God and you are not. And if that's true, when we think about the first part, we have to recognize that basically, God is in control. God is in charge. And if we actually consider that to be true, then truly, when we think about the last part, it would be arrogant to assume that we know better than God. It would be arrogant to say that we have plans that he must bless. Ultimately, what is your life? It's a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. What James is saying, humble yourselves to the reality of truth. The truth is, God is God and we are not. He is supremely powerful, we are not. So when we're making our plans, which are good, recognize that God is God and we are not. And so the last part, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. I want to finish with this. As I said, James is frank. He's basically calling us out. He's saying if you think that you are going to muscle God out, you're not. You're arrogant in taking that position. We never refer to ourselves as arrogant. We refer to other people as arrogant, right? But we don't see this in our own lives. And this sort of stuff creeps in very small ways. I was thinking about, what's the application here? One of the best things I could think of was, your retirement planning. If you go online, you get those calculators, they basically tell you, okay, you need to commit this much each month, and if you get a basic market rate of return, even if you're conservative, you'll have enough. We all do that. We've all thought about that. We all need to make sure that when we stop working, we can pay our bills at some level. And James is even saying, even in a situation like that, which seems basically certain, compounding annual returns of your finances over time, it's not certain. And for you to think that it will be there, or for you to think that you'll even be alive at that point, suggests that you have plans that God may or may not actually realize. And so when we think about this arrogance, we shouldn't receive this as you're arrogant and God is not, etc. We should just say, if we're truly grappling with the reality that God is sovereign and we are not, then we can embrace the reality that we make our plans, but he ordains our steps, right? Okay, so the final point here, ultimately is to say, to encourage you guys, really, to say, pursue excellence. God has made you in his image. He demands everything. He expects more than you expect of yourself. So pursue excellence. But recognize that in the process of pursuing that, we are either about our own agenda or we are about God's agenda. And of course, we know in the story of Christ, he found joy in letting go of any potential agenda that would save his life. In the garden, what does he say? He says, Lord, take this cup from me if you would. But then immediately he says, but Lord, not my will, be done, yours. And then we know what happens next, of course. And so for him, it was joyful that he would give up any potential human plans to essentially get us. And in the process of doing that, we got God, right? We got a pathway to the Almighty. And so today I think we can be hopeful, which is there's a model that's gone before us in Christ, which is die to self. And actually there's joy in dying to self. When we actually come to terms with the death of our own ambition, the death of our own selfish plans, the death of all the things that we require of God, and we lay them at the table and give them to him, we get God. We don't get a blessing because we were generous. We don't get sort of the thing that we've always hoped for deep in our heart. We get God. And what I was saying in my reflection was I used to think that was boring. But who would you have dinner with tonight if there was anyone in history, right? You'd go sit next to Jesus Christ. Would there be anybody else that even remotely compares to a meal with that man? That's what he's saying. When we die and when we let go of our ambition, we get Christ. Final comment here. This is a great story. I heard about it 2 weeks ago. Anybody recognize the guy on the screen? Do not say it if you do. I wouldn't have recognized him 2 weeks ago, okay? This is a pastor, Scottish guy, born in 1874, and he died at the age of 43. 15 years into his life, he became a Christian. 10 years later, he became a preacher. 10 years later, it's World War I. He hasn't really done anything substantial or amazing or interesting in his life, and he decides to go serve with the YMCA in Egypt. So he's literally like a runner, running with the soldiers, trying to basically encourage them on the front lines, preaching to them, nourishing them spiritually. He's a chaplain, okay? And the guy dies of complications with an appendectomy at the age of 43. He leaves his wife and his daughter. One daughter, one wife. Nothing, he had published nothing at this time. He was, in the world's terms, he was a nobody. He was a nobody. What did you do with your life? 43 years, you died. What's on your tombstone, right? What's your legacy? Well, the story goes on. His wife actually was this incredibly talented stenographer, okay? So as he was preaching, she was writing. And she could write like 160 words a minute with her hands, right? It's an incredible gift from God. And 5 years later, she began to basically take his teachings and write them down. And this guy's name is Oswald Chambers, and his wife compiled something called My Utmost for His Highest. He didn't write it, she wrote it. And I was blown away with this story because we look at this guy's life and we say, what did you do? And if we measured it by the 43 years of what he accomplished with his hands, I think the world would say, okay, fine, you were sacrificial, you were loving, you were kind, but at the end of the day, like, you're not a hero. Friends, I don't know that there's a more distributed devotional than My Utmost for His Highest. Its circulation, basically dwarfs anything else, right? So we don't know what God is doing, but what we do know is that God has gone before us, and we do know that it is good. And we may not get the benefit or the blessing of seeing it come to pass in our own life, but God will bring it to completion, right? So this morning, when we think about our lives, work hard, be excellent, get after it, and in the very same breath, die to it and recognize that God is going to make it perfect. So what do we hope for? We hope for the realization of that perfection, and we find the joy in the death of self. So brothers, I'm just going to say it, die today. Die to your ambition. Give it all to God. Recognize that as we walk out of here, He's going to make it complete, and it's going to be good. So get ready for that because we don't know what it looks like, but it's going to be awesome. So thanks for having me. Appreciate being.